All right. Welcome everybody to lecture 2 about the causal theory, or causal theory. So what I want to do today, I want to quickly go through Russell's version of descriptivism. So this was some of the stuff we didn't get to talk about last week. And that's really just going to be a slightly different formulation of the very broad descriptivist project that Frege was developing. Importantly, right, Frege put his descriptions, kind of packed them into these Platonic objects, these Phrygian senses. Russell wasn't super a fan of these Platonic entities, and he wanted to try and find another way to cash out the descriptivism. And so he did this via what we'll call propositional functions. More on this shortly. So we'll talk about that, but I want to go through that quickly in order to then get to Kripke's 3 arguments. Now many of us talked about these 3 years ago, these sort of very broad objections to descriptivist project. So I want to go through them and highlight what it is about descriptivism that these 3 arguments target and why they seem to suggest that descriptivism is at least universally a flawed project. It might work in some cases, but it's not going to work in every case. Then we're going to talk about the alternative. So this is also developed by Kripke, and this is a causal theory, a causal account of the meaning of proper names. And importantly, the causality here is often misplaced. But I want to try and be very clear about that, and so that's what we'll talk about. And then in the end, once we've got all of that sort of done, because of course we're going to build it up and then raise up the big problem for it, right? That's what we do in philosophy class. We'll talk about where to go. What the upshot of this sort of debate that we will have blitzed through these 2 weeks has been, and what this means for the broader project of thinking about semantics. Because remember, this sort of framework here was trying to understand semantics as a general project. And we thought, right, okay, the idealistic framework doesn't really work. It entails that there cannot be same saying, there cannot really be communication. So, okay, we need to somehow get something externally involved. Easy option, let's think about reference. And that led us very quickly to the sort of proper names as a test bed, an initial case. Because surely, if any of them are going to be easy with regards to reference, it's something like a proper name. You have the word, you have the object. But the likely upshot of what we've been doing for this week and the week before is even that initial super easy test case turns out to be far more complicated than we thought. Okay, so our first bit, Russell's descriptivism. We can get a grip of Russell's descriptivism and his concepts of propositional functions by looking at 2 related sentences. You can say, I met a man, he gave a lecture. In these 2 sentences, we see the 2 types of descriptions. One of them is an indefinite description. It's an indefinite description in the sense that it doesn't pick out or purport to pick out any one particular person. I could say, I met a man, in fact, I met 7. That's not wrong. But note the he in the second sentence, right? The he in the second sentence is suggesting that there's a singular individual. It's encoding something like, the man that I met, suggesting that the initial indefinite description was actually meant to say something like, there is one and only one man that I met. And that individual then did, in this case, gave a lecture. So we have a contrast between indefinite ones and definite ones. And we can express these again using our logical notation. It's not super important, but we can say, hey, there's something that's a man and I met it. Or we can say there's exactly one thing that a man that I met and it gave a lecture. Again, relatively familiar, not super important for what we want to do here. As long as we can see the difference between these 2 functions, these 2 descriptions. What is useful is the quantifiers we're using in both cases, that backward z attached to the little x. That is going to be our propositional function. Russell is going to, instead of postulating Phrygian senses, these Platonic objects in the third realm, we're going to have propositions. Propositions are going to be complexes of things out in the world in a very rigid, structured order. And then we'll have functions on these propositions. And these functions will map to truth or falsity. And we express them using our voice. That's the quick, dirty version of what we're going to talk about. So, again, we can take I met a man. Notably, a man by itself cannot be a proposition on its own. It doesn't express a sentence. It's not a complete, not Phrygian, but it's not a complete thought. Not to use the Phrygian notion of thought, but just kind of, it's not even a complete sentence. Instead, it's something like is a man. There's a gap. And there's a gap that needs to be filled. And when we fill the gap, we'll get a full proposition, a full sentence, a full state of the world, as it were. And there are lots of ways we can fill that gap. Please.
Why is that? Why is that not a sentence?
Good. So, is a man. Who? What's it talking about?
Well, I encountered an object X, and that X happens to be a man.
Good, but note there you still use the placeholder. You use the X. You filled in the gap. With a propositional function, the function you used was, I encountered an X. You basically used something. But you couldn't just have, is a man. That's the issue here. Right?
Okay.
If you just had this, you haven't quite got there yet.
So if I say I encountered an object X and X is a man, that would be then I filled the gap.
Then you fill the gap.
Okay.
Because when we think about the ways we fill the gap, we can do this explicitly with proper names. Jack is a man. Or we can do this with quantifiers. Someone is a man. Everyone is a man. No one is a man. Right? These are ones that we can express using our quantifiers, but we can also just do them in natural language. So when you said an X, right, we're implicitly using this. There's something out there. And that's already filling in some way, giving us a subject for our predicate to latch onto. You can think about this too in very basic English grammar, right? English is a language where we take subject and then we have verb for the subject to be doing. You can also have objects, right? Direct object, indirect object, things like this. You can express sentences where you drop the subject, but that's because it's implicitly there. The structure is still going to be, there is a subject, a thing, a gap filler, and then the verb, the action. In this case, the predicate that's being satisfied. It's in the structure. So when we fill in this gap, we can do it with proper names, or we can use propositional functions. Some, all, none, many. Right? So an indefinite description. Right? To go back, remember, these ones. They're going to be understood as propositions that are going to be filled one way or another. Figuring in a name, figuring in a some, none, every, many, etc., etc., etc. I mean, most of the time do this as propositional functions, but we can do it with proper names, whatever you like. So quick, dirty English grammar lesson. Right? Definite descriptions, though, are already filled in. Yeah?
Are there cases where you cannot fill in an indefinite description, where you simply can't? As you said, indefinite description can be understood as a proposition that is going to be filled one way or another.
Yeah.
So it seems like a prophecy.
So I don't think you're going to get any that, well, okay, you could have an indefinite description that's just simply kind of blank, like, is a man, but importantly, you're not actually finishing, there's no sentence there. So perhaps we can say that whenever an indefinite description is used as a proposition, it's always going to be filled. That's maybe a slightly tighter way to express the idea. Because otherwise you just got like a proto-proposition, something that's not quite done yet. Okay, so how do we do definite descriptions? Well, definite descriptions, for those we talked about a couple years ago, they're easy. Right? Definite descriptions are propositional functions that have been filled in. It is saying there's at least one thing that's an F, there's at most one thing that's an F, and that F is G. There's an at least and at most to give us exactly one. So it is in effect an indefinite description that we filled in with a very particular complex propositional function. A propositional function, I think it's on the next slide, propositional function that looks like that. We basically had this is a G, and we filled it in this case with a really long and complex thing that tells us there's at least one F, there's at most one F, and that thing that is F is the thing that is G. Again, don't stress too much about the formulation. Right? It's just a helpful way to draw that back out. What's important is these definite descriptions are not, according to Russell, proper names. They're descriptions. They're propositional functions. They're just like some, many, none, every. They're just more complex, but they're just propositional functions. And he drives this home because logical proper names are simple. In fact, he's quite happy to buy Millionism about logically proper names. That is, proper names in the idealized logical language. But that's in the idealized logical language, not in natural language. In natural language, what we speak every day, there are no proper names. Proper names are just concealed definite descriptions. Every proper name that we speak that will be in natural language isn't a proper name. It is a definite description. It is just a packaging, a repackaging of a propositional function that tells us there's at least one thing and at most one thing that does blah, 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 blah.
How about something like wisdom or 12?
Good. So these are still going to turn out to be definite descriptions. For things like numbers, we'll have a really easy time, right? Because we'll be able to define up formal properties. For wisdom, we're probably going to have to do things like the thing that was said to be had by Socrates, that's loved by philosophers. There's nothing blocking us building a lot of different things into that description. But every one of these are going to turn out to be definite descriptions. There's no logically proper names. It's a good question, right? It's a very big claim about the nature of natural language. But remember, we mentioned this last week, there's an implicit kind of thing here that both Frege and Russell like, which is that natural language is kind of messy. And it would be better to adopt something like an idealized language. Because this idealized, perfectly logical language, the puzzles, or at least some of the puzzles that we talked about, just don't come up. Those are mistakes. Okay. So again, Russell's big idea, we can understand natural language proper names as encoded definite descriptions. So when we ask whether Homer existed, we're using the word Homer as an abbreviated definite description. We may replace it by, say, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The same considerations apply to almost all uses of what look like proper names. Now the quantifier here, the quantifier of almost all, is because he wants to go on and talk about logically proper names. But in natural language, it's going to be all of them. So what's the advantage here? We don't need to invoke Phrygian senses. We don't have to have these Platonic entities that somehow encode the descriptions that are or encode modes of presentation. Rather, the meaning of these names just is the definite description. The meaning of Socrates is an encoded definite description, a propositional function, which then goes out and latches on to these proto-propositions. So it's kind of an advantage here. Right? We don't have to have the Phrygian senses. We're not going to necessarily run into the same issues that Frege did. Before I go on, questions?
What again was the problem with Frege then?
Good.
The problem with the senses?
So one big issue with Frege, we talked about this earlier, one big issue with the senses is there's a concern about synonymy. So this was makes his book. Remember ketchup and catsup.
Yeah.
That's one big issue. That's often taken to be the big issue. Another one is that we're not necessarily always in a position to grasp what the content of the mode of presentation is. We might disagree about what goes in the description of Aristotle. And that's bad for Frege, but it's not necessarily bad for Russell. Because Russell could force us to unpack our descriptions. Frege, it's sort of out there, and one of us would just be getting it wrong. Yeah.
So he says there are no proper names in natural language, it's all secretly definite descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
Does he say this is a good thing, I'm going to use this, we just throw proper names out of the window, or does he say this is a bad thing, so we need to have a more formalized thing?
It's a good thing for natural language, right? Because what it does is it's going to let us avoid or solve the puzzles that we faced. In the ideal language, those puzzles, many of them, won't come up. There won't be any empty names in the ideal language. We wouldn't make that mistake.
There are proper names.
There are proper names.
And he wants that.
He wants those in the idealized language. But of course, that's not what we're going to speak. This is the kind of thing that's, if you like, underpinning what we'll actually speak. Yeah. But he is going to have logically proper names, but not in natural language. That is going to come back to bite him in the ass. So remember the four puzzles, right? Reference to non-existence, negative existentials, Frege's puzzle about how can identity claims be cognitively significant, and these substitution cases, which don't seem to be possible, shouldn't be possible, at least on Millionism. Frege's solution was pretty creative, right? He can say that these are meaningful, just neither true nor false. These are cognitively significant because of different modes of presentation. These ones, when you embed inside the belief, the embedded sentence no longer refers to true or false. It refers to its regular sense, its thought, its Phrygian thought. And there'll be different thoughts here. But one of the big issues, too, was exactly what Frege said here. This sentence is neither true nor false for Frege. Russell did not like that. Russell didn't like it because it violates the law of excluded middle, which basically says for any given sentence, either it or its negation is true. Now, Russell has one more bit of kit, and this is very easy to see. I put it in terms of the formalism, but we don't have to. It's basically just the scope of a definite description. The description, in particular the quantifier associated with it, can either have wide scope, that is, it can be the main operator of the sentence, or it can have narrow scope. That is, it could have other operators ranging over it. So this says, hey, there is something, it's a K, there's only one K, and that thing is not a B. This says it's not the case that there is something, blah, 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 blah. Note the difference in where the negation is. This one, our quantifier has narrow scope. It's a secondary occurrence. And this one has got primary occurrence. It is the big scope. This is going to be very useful for the law of excluded middle stuff. To see why. How do we make sense of talk of negative non-existence? It's easy. It's just using a definite description. Odysseus was Greek. The thing that was Odysseus, or is O, where O is here just a shorthand way to unpack a really long definite description. There's at least one thing that's O, there's at most one thing that's O, and the thing that is O is a G. And that sentence is false, because the existential is false. There isn't at least one such thing. So that's a leg up on Frege already. These aren't just meaningful, they have a truth value. They're false. Holmes is the detective. There's at least one thing that Sherlock's, there's at most one thing that Sherlock's, and the thing that Sherlock's is a detective. False. There is not at least one such thing. So that's pretty good. And remember, Frege had to say that these were neither true nor false. They just sort of misfired. That's nice. The same thing, too, with negative existentials. These can be true. And they're true because it's just saying, cool, you just negated my definite description. That's easy. It's not the case that there is such a thing. Yeah, I agree. So that's a big advantage. Right? That's a big advantage over Frege. With Frege's puzzle, we can pull the same trick Frege did. Why are these cognitively significant? Because there's different encoded definite descriptions in the two names. So you're learning that two definite descriptions co-designate. Again, I've expressed it with the formalism. You don't need to know it, but it just tells us there's at least one F, at least one G, at most one F, at most one G, and they are the same thing. That can be valuable to learn. Two descriptions, pick out the exact same thing. Neat. And the substitution puzzle is going to be the exact same thing. The secondary occurrence of the description is different. The embedded descriptions are different. So the thoughts engaged with are different. Cool. Easy peasy. That's kind of nice. And again, he's got an edge over Frege because he's going to avoid truth value gaps. To give you an example, to go way back, we can think about the present king of France is bald. According to Russell, this is false. According to Frege, it is neither true nor false. The present king of France is not bald. Well, if you read this with the negation out in front, as in it's not the case that he's bald, for Russell, that's true. Because it's not the case that there's at least one thing that's the present king of France. But if you read it with a narrow scope, as in there is this thing and it has the property of being hirsute, right, having lots of hair, well, then it's false because there is no such thing. That's a big advantage. He can keep excluded middle. Unlike Frege, he don't have no truth value gaps. That's nice. If you want to play this kind of game, if you want to have classical logic, which both of them did. So that's the kind of advantage here, right? We move away from these Phrygian senses, and we just force every use of natural language proper names into definite descriptions. Okay, before we go on to the issues, questions on the Russellian approach here. I know I'm going super fast, but I hope it's clear. Going okay? Yeah, please.
Briefly, recapitulate like the last one, the present
Cool.
king of France, because both are the present king of France doesn't exist, right?
So Russell thinks these two should both be false, right? He thinks that's intuitive, exactly because, like you said, he doesn't exist. Frege can't say that. Frege has to say they are neither true nor false. So how does Russell make sense of it? Well, he reads this as a definite description. In fact, to go back some slides, he reads it as that, without the negation, which is false, because there is no such thing as a present king of France. And then for the second one, the present king of France is not bald, with the negation. That's also false. There is no such thing. But if you feel like it should be true, he can give you that too. Because you're reading it as it's not the case that he's bald, which for Russell will come out true. But for Frege is neither true nor false. Because if you feed in something that has no truth value to our negation, it does nothing. Garbage in, nothing out. So that's the advantage. If you feel like, as Russell did, that these ought to have truth values, that they both should be false, because there is no present king of France. Well, Frege was in trouble. Russell can solve that problem. Yeah?
Is this then the same as on the previous slide with non-existence, or how does it differ?
It's very close. It's very close, right? So if we want to say that present king of France doesn't exist, we can just stick it out in front. Note that what we don't have to have is any extra bit there. So we could even say the present king of France is a non-existent bald man. Now that's strictly kind of abusing language, because he isn't any of these things. But that's a kind of funny way to say, it's not the case that he exists and is bald. This is, again, another instance where the messiness of natural language can kind of get in the way. But the trick is the same in both cases, to come back to your question. The trick is the same. It is just this. Once we formulate them in our logical language, you can see that there's different places for us to put the negation. And if you have the primary occurrence, then it's going to depend on whether the existential is true. If you have a secondary occurrence, well, then it's just about what happens with the thing in front. Okay, nice. So that's Russell in a nutshell. Russell's theory faces three problems, one of which is probably much worse than the others. The first one is pretty bad. And it's that we seem to be able to use definite descriptions in an incorrect way. Okay, so imagine we're at a party, and there's someone in the corner with a martini glass, and in the martini glass is a broadly clear liquid. They've got a little olive on a stick, like floating in it. And I lean over to you and I say, hey, the man in the corner drinking the martini is suspicious. But imagine instead of actually having a martini, they've just got water. They're a fucking weirdo and they like to put olives in their water. Who knows, right? Whatever. It seems like I still managed to pick out that person. Because again, I said, the man in the corner drinking the martini. You could agree with me, or you might disagree with me. You would know who I'm talking about. That's a problem, though. Because he doesn't satisfy that definite description. So how could you know who I'm talking about? We've misfired. Do we see the trick? Another easy one, right? Suppose I say, hey, the tallest member of the philosophy department's Scottish. I bet most of you know that I'm trying to refer to Alfred, right? If you run into Alfred. But of course, that definite description doesn't pick him out. It's probably Richard, I think. And Richard isn't Scottish. Again, fill in your other examples. We can have these incorrect definite descriptions that still somehow get us to some object. That is, something that doesn't satisfy the description can be picked out. Yeah.
Is this the really bad one?
This is not the really bad
Oh
one.
yeah, so
But this is a bad one. Right? This is a bad one. Because we can continue on with this, right? So we could say, okay, let's call him Steve. Dude, Steve's really suspicious. I saw Steve kind of moving around in somebody's bedroom, right? Stealing money, these kinds of things. But if this is the definite description that's encoded in Steve, we're misfiring every single time. You see the problem?
Isn't this just a problem in very loose natural language? Because the things we can refer to are very limited. So, I'm not sure if he's drinking a martini, but there are only 4 people in the room, and there's only one of them in the corner. So I know, even though he might not drink a martini, he's the only guy in the corner and drinks like martini. So I only actually pick him out in very loose situations.
But note here, again, if what we're worried about is that initial problem about the idealized version of language, we need to have some kind of same saying. Everybody needs to be able to mean the same thing with their terms.
We could just say the man in the corner who appears to be drinking a martini.
But note, that's a different description. That's the important thing.
The person who said this wasn't thinking very clearly, I would say. Just
good. So what we can start to do is pull a difference between speaker's intention and what speakers actually say. Problem, if we start to move into speaker's intention, we're dangerously close towards that idealistic conception of language. Because now we need to know, hey, did you mean this? Or did you mean the one who appears to be drinking a martini? And again, this is a toy example. We can extend this further.
This would get solved if you use the denotation and connotation of the modes of presentation, or do you still have that problem?
Well, so if we appeal to these modes of presentation, right, those were in a sense accessible to us, but not fixed by us. So there's a sense in which this gets solved, but it gets solved in a way that maybe we get it wrong.
Yeah.
Remember, one of the problems with Frege is we can disagree about the content of a name, the mode of presentation associated with the name. This is that flipped around.
Yeah.
We might articulate a description and get it wrong. Not wrong in the sense of the description associated with the name is different than we thought, but the description doesn't pick out the thing we use the name to refer to. That's the problem. Okay, so there's our first one. And again, we can do a demarcation between speaker's reference and semantic reference by appealing to something like intention. But then, of course, we're already back into this something like we need for them to articulate their intention, their intent. And that starts to draw back in this sort of idealistic notion. Not entirely, but we can start to see the cracks. The second one is cases where we have kind of generic definite descriptions or indefinite definite descriptions. Sounds slightly funny, but think about the whale is a mammal or the mosquito carries malaria. Right? So note the here is used in a kind of definite way, but it's not picking out a single individual. It's picking out something like a class or a type. So Russell was thinking that his treatment of definite descriptions characterized every instance of the in English. And we show that can't be right. Because it's not like there's one mosquito out there that's the thing that carries malaria. Like there's the mosquito. Oh God, it's coming for us. And that one thing is what's carrying malaria. Right? It's meant to be a generic. It's a generic. Some mosquitoes carry malaria. Generics are funny. They're very weird. And we can get the same thing with incomplete definite descriptions. This is kind of a version of the top one where we just have something like, oh, the headphones are on the table. Right? We get it in this context. But of course, we could easily think of contexts where there'll be multiple headphones, multiple tables, and suddenly this definite description no longer is definite anymore. The tallest person in the room, what happens if there's multiple equally tall ones? That's kind of, again, not super worrisome, but if we're articulating every instance of the as a definite description, the big one's this one. The big one is the bottom one. So Russell doesn't want to have proper names in natural language, but he will allow for proper names in logically perfect languages. This idealized version of language. The problem is that unless every logically proper name is a definite description, basically that we can do this machinery all the way up, we're going to get Frege puzzles and substitution cases in the logically proper language too. Because people have to learn the language. People will learn that A and B co-denote, and that can be informative, even in the logically perfect language. Because the idealized language isn't just sort of immediately given. You have to learn it. And there'll be Frege puzzles and substitution failure puzzles, even in the logically perfect language. That's the problem. If there is ever proper names, and it is ever such that we are allowed to make identity statements with different names on either side, which even the logically perfect language will need to do, then we are going to run into problems. So again, it's basically like this might work for natural language, but aren't we just going to run into the same issues once we persistify? Okay. Yeah.
So basically, because not everybody knows logical, like the formal logics, problems will keep arising.
You can put it this way. However you want to cash out this ideal language, it looks like even in the ideal language, we're still going to have informative identity statements. And if we have informative identity statements, the same puzzle comes up.
I wonder, I remember one of the problems with descriptions is that you should be able to criticize descriptions. In the example of Aristotle, that whether he's born in, what was it, Stagira or not?
Yeah. Sigia, yeah. Yeah.
But is that part of this, one of these three problems? No.
Not yet. We're going to come to
Okay.
that. But
That
yes,
seems to be the biggest problem, right?
That is
you cannot
one-
have a definite description because you might not have all knowledge. Or
that's going to be a big issue too. And that's the nice thing is that's a problem for both of them. It's not just for Russell. That's going to be a problem for Frege and Russell. Yeah.
So it says that unless every logically proper name is a definite description, we get problems.
Yes.
So why can't every logically proper name be a definite description?
So it could be. It could be such that we can get rid of all names in every single occurrence. The thing is, at least Russell, when he articulated his view, said that there needed to be some logically proper names. Because he's worried about an ability to formulate predicates like is Odysseus. That will be characterized in terms of like, is Greek, is these, you unpack it. And as we unpack all of these predicates, he thinks that at some point we're going to have to start invoking names. Even
Otherwise you
if
get
it's,
definite regression.
Yeah.
Or, yes. Okay.
even if it's going to just be names for things like raw sensations, qualia, whatever, we're going to have some names in order to then formulate the next level of predicates to keep going back up to get the descriptions. That's the real worry. That's why he thinks there has to be at least some of these. But of course, we could try and do this. In fact, that's what Quine wanted to do, which I think maybe somebody talked to you about that last year. But it's not clear that that's successful at all. All right. So, again, what we have between Frege and Russell, two versions of a kind of similar view. The meaning of a proper name isn't just a reference, it is this third kind of element, being the encoded definite description or the Phrygian sense. And then in the early 70s, so importantly, this sort of view about how proper names work, arguably was the standard. And then in the 70s, Saul Kripke came along and kind of blew it all up. And it's worth emphasizing that when this came out, it fundamentally changed a ton of debates in philosophy of language, in metaphysics, and in logic, because it overthrew a number of dominant paradigms, or at least showed some pretty major cracks in it. So I want to talk about the three puzzles that he raises against this descriptivism. And it's important to kind of get a run-up on it. Oh, crap, I forgot to ask. Do people want to go for a bit and break, or do we want to end early? Break? Let's do, yeah, no, actually, I need a break too. Can we do 10 more minutes and then a break? Is that okay with everybody? Okay, I want to get into this a little bit and then we'll go. So the first thing to note, in order to talk about the crypty stuff, we need to talk about modality, possibility, and necessity. Okay? So way back stuff, we want to say things like, hey, possibly my shirt is clean. It's not, it's covered in chalk dust because I've been teaching all day, but it could have been clean. There's a possible situation where it's clean. So we can understand possibility claims as basically saying something like, hey, there's a possible world at which P, shirt is clean. Right? Similarly, we might say that some things are necessarily the case. They must be true. Not just are true, but have to be. They are true in every possibility. So we can characterize this by saying, hey, in every possible world, P. And we have a last little fun thing. We can also say, hey, actually P means it's true in the possible situation we're actually in. This one. This is just, again, a little useful thing in the back, right? Now, with this kind of background, we can start to think about some cases. So suppose we talk about, like, possibly Nathan's Canadian. So it looks like the way to understand this is saying something like, there's a possible world where this thing, this object, has the property of being Canadian. Similarly, jokingly, right, if setting aside theological worries, necessarily Satan's evil. This is saying something like, look, hey, in every one of these possible situations, that very thing is evil. You look in every one of those big spaces, those big possible scenarios, you find your big horn dude, and he's a baddie. Not a baddie, that's the wrong term. You get what I'm after. A baddie in the old sense. In some of them, that might be true too. Here's another one. Here's a really weird one. So take possibly Nathan's sister, Natalie, is blonde. Now here's a weird thing. I'm an only child. But at least we can make sense of that claim. I think, arguably. Now, the problem here is that in that case, what we're locking onto isn't even a real object. It's not an actual object. Because again, I'm an only child. But we can lock onto some kind of object in some other situation that will be Natalie, my sister, and then she'll have the property of being blonde, say. Do we see the process? Yeah.
Could this again be said for the present King of France as well?
Cool. So we'll come to that bit. Right? We'll come to that bit. Yeah.
I found it a bit hard, like necessarily Satan is evil, so I would just believe it because I respect the rule. But why can't I just say there is a world where Satan is true?
In some sense, I don't really care about the example. I just want you to see how it works, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I don't care. Again, set aside theological concerns.
Yeah.
Plug in whatever one you want. 2 is even.
Yeah.
Right? That works too.
But it's about where you decide, or how you decide, or argument it's necessary, right? Or is there like a rule for it?
There'll be some questions about how we populate all the spaces of possibility. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
What kind of scenarios are we taking to be genuinely possible or not? That's a heavy question. But what's important is we can see the sort of structure here, right? We can set aside worries about which worlds are out there.
Yeah.
It's a good question. Yeah.
No.
It's the same thing. Okay. Yeah. Again, what I'm interested in, what I'm trying to emphasize is just this process, right? I don't care about the actual examples. I just care about the structure here. Like the first one, we've got me in a different scenario. But think about how we picked me out. We used my name, right? So in that world, the way that we picked out the thing that is me, which has different properties than in actuality, because I'm Californian, I'm not Canadian, it's still Nathan. There's Nathan. In that world, he's Canadian. In that world, he's, I don't know, Colombian. That'd be a really weird world. There you go. It finally had its head. So the idea here is that when we think about the name Nathan, it seems to be functioning as what we'll call a rigid designator. It's a term that picks out the same object in every possible scenario. That is, we use it, looking, if you like, metaphorically, out over the space of worlds, and our use of Nathan picks out the same object in every world that I'm there. Note, it doesn't matter what the people in that world use the name for, because we ain't them, right? Or at least in this sort of circumstance, we're not them. The name is rigid because it's picking out the same object in every world. So that's a very important concept, and it's worth being clear. Yes?
It's also a very problematic concept, because strictly spoken, the first sentence, I wouldn't even know what it means. You in another world being Canadian.
Good.
But why, how can you then speak of the same object?
Good. So if we want to go so far as to say that things couldn't be different than they actually are, that is an option. But note the consequences of that option.
I agree.
There's going to be a lot of very weird stuff that follows from that. Because it isn't just that things would be then true, they're necessarily true. The fact that I'm Californian is a necessary truth. The fact that I happen to weigh, 111 kilos. Right? Oh, fuck, no wonder my diet doesn't work. Because it's a necessary truth that I'm a fat ass, right? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I agree.
The consequences of that are pretty steep. So that's the important thing to note here.
Yeah. But there are, a little bit of continuation. There's a possible world in which you weigh less than 100 kilos seems to be more realistic or more possible than a world in which you are Canadian.
Good. So note again, we don't really care about exactly, this is kind of what we were talking about a second ago. The particular examples aren't really important. What's important is, again, the sort of general structure. For the first example, it's picking me, plugging me into a different scenario. Why a different scenario? Because there I can have different properties than I actually do.
Yeah. Okay.
Hold on. Yeah.
So about, maybe this is going to get very complicated, I'm not sure, but normally when we talk about possibility, let's say possibly you could have weighed less than 100 kilos if you didn't eat a huge pizza last night.
It's the beer, but yeah.
Anyway, so possibilities are always time bound, right? So at this time, so if you refer to the Nathan for whom that might have been possible, then we say, well, Nathan yesterday evening didn't yet weigh 100 pounds, now he does, so we refer to Nathan yesterday evening, and then
it's definitely not pounds.
Your weight could not possibly be in the definite description.
Good.
So if you were to be Canadian, we could say, well, this embryo, whatever, but then the definite description could not contain your sex.
So we have there's an implicit distinction here between questions of how things might have been versus how things might become. So when we ask questions about how things might become, what we do is we hold fixed past facts and then ask how the future might work out. And I think this is kind of what you were thinking of with a lot of possibility talk. We also hear this in terms of potentiality. That's how it's usually used, right? I don't have the potential to be a failed child actor. Why do I not have that potential? Because I'm too fucking old. I wasn't a child actor. That's already gone. I do not have that potential. But could I have been a child actor? Is there, like, could the world is there a way it might have been such? Do you see the difference?
Yes, but then if we pick out Nathan, we would have to pick him out at the point where he would have been a child and could have become an actor. And if we take out child Nathan,
Yes.
The definite description does not necessarily not include anything that happened after that point.
Good. But note that we can make sense of talking about picking out child Nathan. This is why it's going to lead to a problem for the scriptures.
Okay.
Yes. So importantly, this is why we're setting this up, right? We can do these kinds of things. We can do stuff like, oh yeah, let's lock onto Nathan and think about these other ways things might have been such that I had radically different properties than I actually do, or that I ever could become. Napoleon might have won the Battle of Waterloo. Pretty easy. In fact, he was really close. Very easily might have been the winner. But there is no way for him to become the winner. History is fixed. There's no potential for him to become anything other than the Waterlooser.
It maybe touches on the same problem, but instead of like what is actual and what is possible, I'm wondering about the properties Nathan has. Like what property does Nathan have that makes Nathan Nathan? Because you can always think about a possible world where Nathan is just not Nathan, but another guy with another name acting to be Nathan.
So importantly, this is again, when we think about the rigid designator, we don't care about how they talk in that world. We care about how we would describe the world. The way you described it, right? It's Nathan's there where he isn't there, and there's someone else who's kind of playing a Nathan-like role, but it isn't Nathan.
Yeah.
Cool. We're using the word Nathan in a rigid way, regardless of whatever they speak. Because we use it to pick out the same object in the worlds where I'm there.
So independent of the description.
Well, so that's something we're going to get to, right? Again, what we're trying to do is just to sort of set the stage here, right? We can do these sorts of things where we pick out the objects, we play around with the properties it has, thinking about possible situations where it has radically different properties. That's what I'm trying to get at. It seems like we can rigidly denote an object despite it having different properties than it actually does. Now that alone isn't going to sink definite description theory, right? That's not alone going to destroy the kind of descriptivism, but it sets it up in a pretty bad way. One last thing. Sorry. 2 minutes, then we'll take a break. I'm sorry. It's worth noting that some singular terms are going to be rigid and some are non-rigid. So according to Kripke, proper names are going to be rigid. That is, they pick out the same object in every world that they purport to pick anything out. But many other ones aren't going to be. Here's the test. Ask yourself, could N not have been N? Could the present king of France not have been the present king of France? Well, that one's maybe a bad one. Could the present king of England not be the present king of England? Absolutely, right? Let's imagine that he had died before his mom died, that almost happened a couple times, right? That would be an easy one. So the present king of England isn't a rigid designator. Is it possible that the current president of the US might not have been the president of the US? Oh, fucking absolutely. That's why we're in the bad timeline, right? But again, you can see these descriptions aren't rigid. They pick out different things in different cases. Do we see that, right? Contrast that, could Nathan have not been Nathan? The only way you can hear that is the second one, you're using it as a kind of like qualitative description. You're saying, could this object have not been, well, you know, the kind of way that he usually is? Right? And sure, that's true. But that's not to use it as a name in the second case. That's to use it as a very rough and ready way to get at something like a description. Not even necessarily a definite one. Could Nixon have not been Nixon? That doesn't make sense, according to Kripke, if you use the name in the same way in both cases. Could A have not been A? What do you even, what? Says Kripke. So the upshot, at least according to Kripke, is that all proper names are going to be rigid. Definite descriptions are mostly not. Some of them will be. And we can get the rigid ones by cheating. We build in an actuality operator. Because this will be like the become. The actual loser of Waterloo is and always will and forever be Napoleon. But he could have won. There's other situations where he won. But the actual situation, that's done and past. So this is a rigid definite description, but only because how this word works. Okay. Feeling good about rigidity? Feeling strong, firm? In some really terrible versions of this, people, instead of using non-rigid, they use flaccid, but that always just feels slightly dirty. So I just prefer non-rigid. Oh God, that was a bad thing to say too. Anyway, okay, so it's 11, it's 42. Should we take a break to 55? Is that okay? So 12 and a half minutes or so? Cool, okay.